Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be part of this really exciting Building Bridges discussion that explores how to develop socially just global genomics research. In this presentation, I will draw on my work on the ethics of African genomics research as well as my work on science equity, to give a perspective on what the promotion of social justice means, at least in part, for African genomics. My name is Jantina de Vries and I'm based at the University of Cape Town. So I'd like to start my contribution with this rather stark image that depicts what I think is the state of play in international genetics and genomics research. Because despite very considerable investments in African genomics research over the last decade, African researchers continue to play upfield. Specifically, they play upfield when seeking funding for their work, when it comes to things like training and mentorship opportunities or infrastructure, broadly understood as the machines but also the bandwidth and the reagents needed to foster proper genomics research. Importantly, African researchers also play upfield when it comes to credibility, suffering from pervasive discriminatory beliefs and stereotypical attitudes. Which brings me to the first important observation that I want to bring to the panel discussion. Namely, I think that in order to work towards a socially just global genomics, we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that science is a meritocracy, that if you work really hard and you have very good ideas, you will thrive. Instead, it focuses our attention on the many instances of systemic bias that make it really hard for some people to thrive. Examples of systemic bias are, for instance, a culture of white supremacy and patriarchy, the pervasive effects of colonialism, elitism and privilege, as well as scientific racism and misogyny. All of these impact on African scientists' ability to thrive in science. So my first response to a question of how to foster a socially just global genomics research is to take seriously the many ways in which systemic bias undermines the ability of many scientists around the world to thrive. The reason that it is so important to understand systemic bias in relation to genetics and genomics better is that it impacts on scientists' ability to thrive or flourish. It also impacts on the breadth of diverse perspectives that we are able to bring to bear in our scholarship. Important to note here, of course, is that systemic bias does not only influence African scholars, it influences scholars worldwide. Moreover, what is important is to understand the intersectionality of different forms of bias or discrimination. The concept of intersectionality reminds us that different elements of our identities, such as our race and gender or the institutions to which we belong, all come with their own sources of advantage and disadvantage. Now, why do I think that science systemic bias matters so much? And this is the second main contribution that I would like to make to the panel, and it relates to a question of why we ought to promote social justice in global genomics and genetics research. From almost 20 years of working in and on African genomics, I think that the reason it matters is that ideally the researchers who are close to the burden of disease ought to be the ones investigating those diseases. I think it is important for the quality and relevance of the science conducted. In terms of the quality of the science conducted, it strikes me that the people who are close to the burden of disease are in a much better position to understand patterns of disease. They observe, for instance, that when COVID transmission patterns change, this could signal the emergence of a new variant, as was the case in this paper, for instance. They can also relate geography to disease transmission, as happened in this study on Ebola. Second, scientists who are close to the burden of disease are in a much better position to translate the relevant scientific findings to local and national health policy, meaning that the relevance of the science that is conducted is increased. For instance, in the Western Cape, which is where I'm based, neurologists and medical geneticists strongly argued for the inclusion of genetic diagnostic testing services for autism in the genetic healthcare services in our province, based on their genomic research on this condition. But there's also a third important reason for why I think that it's important that the researchers who are close to the burden of disease should be the one investigating disease. And that is that local researchers are much more likely to be familiar with the culture and the values of the people involved in their research. Based on my experience, this leads to a greater appreciation for the ethical elements of research. For instance, in H3 Africa genomic research, many African PIs were deeply passionate about the importance of community engagement as a critical step in their projects, which is wholly aligned with African communitarian approaches to life. Similarly, an emphasis on solidarity and reciprocity led to particular ways of considering ancillary care obligations in African genomics research. Now, what this means to me is that socially just African genetic and genomic research ideally should be led by African research teams. Yet I think that systemic bias intersects with scientific equality to create a situation where this is not often or often not the case. To promote African intellectual leadership in genetic and genomic research, we need to take a serious look at what we need to do to reduce systemic bias and promote science equity. And to understand the concept of science equity well, it's important that we understand exactly what it tries to indicate. So as you can see in this marvelous image, equity is related to notions of equality and justice, but it's not the same. Specifically, equality means treating people the same, but in a situation of systemic bias and inequality, treating people the same means that some benefit and others cannot participate. If we think about science as only meritocratic, we would be tempted to suggest that people should be treated the same, but that means that the people subjected to systemic bias will not be able to compete. On the contrary, justice denotes a situation where we have recognized and addressed bias so that everyone now has a chance to compete fairly. This is the end goal, obviously, but we have a long way to go before we get there. And until we do, the notion of equity helps us think through the kinds of things we need to do to address the effects of systemic bias. So when applied to science, equity forces us to do two things. Firstly, it requires us to work towards the academic independence of the weaker parties, and specifically of the worst off. Now what that means is that in order to promote science equity, we all need to commit to a moral imperative that specifically promotes the interests of those playing upfield. Secondly, science equity requires us to design tools and interventions that diminish the effects of systemic bias. Examples in science are, for instance, calls for research proposals that only target minority groups, or the creation of professional communities specifically promoting the interests of women in science, for instance. And an example of the latter was the entire H3 Africa consortium, where the funding calls were specifically reserved to primary investigators based on the African continent. And the effects of that in promoting and fostering genomic research on the continents has been absolutely marvelous. So drawing on social justice theory and some of our work in that field, it strikes me that there are 4 key components that should be targeted with equity-oriented science policies. The first is ensuring inclusive decision-making, for instance through policies that specifically strive to include the perspectives of those playing upfield. It also means ensuring that what we call human flourishing, meaning ensuring everyone's ability to thrive, for instance through mutual exchange and capacity building. A third component of science equity involves reducing unfair power relations, which involves ensuring that there is a fair division of labour. A project where African scientists are mere sample collectors is an example of a project where the division of labour is not fair. Finally, a fourth component of science equity is ensuring that and appreciating our differences, for instance in terms of language, culture, infrastructure and worldly experiences. Now, obviously, in an effort to promote science equity and a socially just global genomics research, the elephant in the room is power. To promote science equity and a socially just genomics, what we are asking is for some people who benefit from science and equity to give up their privilege because this is the right thing to do. Obviously, this is not easy, and the heart of our discussion should perhaps be about how and why we can persuade people to share power and promote each other's well-being. In conclusion, promoting socially just global genomics research requires us to have difficult conversations about the many sources of systemic bias in science, how that might benefit us, and what we need to do to ensure that everyone has a fair chance. It also requires us to foster communication, specifically to promote inclusive decision-making across the scientific process, and to agree that we all have different roles and responsibilities, and to recognize our differences constructively. Finally, it requires us to agree that we have a shared moral responsibility towards promoting it. We all have a role to play in fostering socially just global genomics research.